Hello and welcome to the OtCP podcast. I'm joined here today again by Luke Crawford.
Hello.
And today we're going to be discussing visual effects and if they've lost their appeal somewhat. So there's nothing really in the news particularly that sparked this idea for this week, but it's just something that's been on my mind recently. I feel like we've had kind of a lull where we're not as excited about special effects as we used to be back in the day. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a lot of the reason is we're just so oversaturated with them, and they're getting to a point where they're so good that it seems like anything is possible, and therefore nothing is really as exciting as it used to be when visual effects were kind of just on the rise.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, because I think of movies like, I'm going to start by mentioning like when the Superman movie came out and the poster had the like catchphrase, "You'll believe a man can fly," and that was like a big deal. And
was
nowadays
this Superman Returns or is this Man of Steel?
Or like
the
original Superman, Christopher Reeves.
Got it.
Yeah, and now of course you see men flying all the time in superhero movies, so it's not as exciting as it was back then. But another movie I think of is like Avatar was a big deal when it was coming out, and that's not even that long ago. When did Avatar come out? Was that like
2008, but
something like that. Anyway,
somewhere around the late 2000s.
Yeah, I remember that being a huge deal with, like everything is going to be digitally created and
like 3D, IMAX, big budget.
Yeah, and and all digital characters and everything. And that definitely was a huge hit. It definitely made a good amount of money. But I feel like at the same time, it's been kind of forgotten and it's not really culturally relevant anymore, even though they're going to be coming out with more movies. It seems like for the time it was a big deal, but now that we're in this age of visual effects in every blockbuster and yeah, the Jungle Book with all these characters and Lion King, and everyone has CG characters and CG settings and everything. Yeah. Now it doesn't really stand out as much.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about how, like, when Iron Man came out, there was all this, like, I guess, buzz about, like, I guess when it came out or when after people saw it and, like, kind of the beginning of the MCU, it was kind of like this really cool thing to see, like, superheroes created in I guess it began with Spider-Man as well, because Spider-Man 2 actually won an Oscar for visual effects, which I love that movie. But it's just like now that the MCU is coming out with movies 2 times a year, people, I feel like, might be used to it. And so they start comparing, I don't know, like those movies to everything else, or it's just like, it's kind of what you were talking about. It's this oversaturation, and it's no longer this magical or like awe-inspiring thing to see like giant battles of armies fighting each other. It's just kind of like, yeah, I've seen it before. And
yeah, you have people getting really sick of CGI armies and things like that.
Yeah. And I'm curious if it's like people are more critical of a movie's CG if the story is good or if the story is bad, because I know Endgame and Infinity War were these big stories, the bookends of this whole phase of Marvel movies, and people loved the characters and the story, and I didn't really see them be super critical or kind of unimpressed with the effects. But then like Man of Steel, saw people were just kind of annoyed with it. And kind of like, well, they're just flying around.
There are a few different things going on with Man of Steel, but
yeah, but also like the Transformers movies, I look to those as kind of not great as they are for visual effects standpoint. They're, I would say, top tier because of the way Michael Bay uses practical effects along with the visual effects, and how they interact with each other, and it kind of heightens the world, even though, granted, the stories are not that great.
Yeah, I feel like you only really notice the visual effects when something is wrong with it nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know what the last time I walked out of a theater and was like, man, that movie had really great special effects. You don't
Yeah.
really hear that anymore. You hear maybe like a complaint about, okay, that scene looked kind of fake. It's not really, you don't hear praise for visual effects as much anymore. I think you do more nowadays for practical effects. Like people are really excited when they see directors like George Miller with Mad Max Fury Road, I think too. And that a lot of what people don't realize there too is just how much CGI there was in that movie that
Mm-hmm.
was used to supplement and make the scenery and some of the crashes and things. I mean, there was a lot of visual or practical effects as well, and I think, like
Yeah.
you were saying with Michael Bay too, it's just that blending of practical and visual
Yes.
effects. Um,
But there's
yeah, there was
also
a.
like subtle ways people use CGI. Like if you
Mhm.
look at David Fincher and Christopher Nolan, they usually use like stories and settings that don't seem like these big fantastical battles. They seem very real, and these CGI, like in Social Network, you
Mhm.
have Army Hammer playing two different characters, but they're like frequently in the same frame, interacting with each other, and it looks perfect. But like people don't really notice that. They notice the scene where they're where Andrew Garfield and um,
Was it Jesse Eisenberg?
yeah, Jesse Eisenberg, they're standing outside, and people talk about how like their breath looks
Mm.
very fake because
Mhm.
it's fake breath, and people point that out, but they never talk about like or usually they never talk about like the incredible use of CG when the Army Hammer is like rowing the boat. It's
Mhm.
so seamless.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a quote I wanted to share from Guillermo del Toro when talking about visual effects. He said, I feel like we're in a moment now where there's a loss of wonder. And he talks a bit about practical effects, and he always tries to build as much as he can. The more you can make things physical, the better the movie is. And he mentions the Blues Brothers with this huge like car pileup scene,
Oh, I love the
and
Blues
how
Brothers.
wowed people were by it because they knew it was real.
Mm-hmm.
But then nowadays, when we see a huge car pileup in a movie, we assume that most of it is CG.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I don't know. It was a big deal when we knew that everything had to be done for real. But now that we know that anything can be done with CG, we're not
Mm-hmm.
really as excited by it because we know, okay, well, they just did that in a computer, which is also
Mm-hmm.
kind of like harsh towards these visual effects editors that put so much work
Yeah.
into these scenes and things. But it is kind of true where we've lost the wonder of like seeing these huge scenes
Mm-hmm.
um, because we've seen them all the time and we know that they're not really real.
Yeah, and like what, and it's also just like from like a money standpoint, it's easier to have a chase scene in a car wreck be digital than
Hmm.
having to possibly shoot the wreck over and over and over and having to deal with all that stuntmen, and
Right.
when you can have visual effects artists work uh however long they need to
Yeah,
on
and
a scene.
one thing with like Fincher too, he's all about like I remember hearing something about like he uses visual effects because you know you can get it to work the way you want it to work. You know, he's talking
Yes.
about like blood in his scenes,
Hmm.
and there's too much uncertainty with practical effects. You don't know how it's gonna work exactly, but with visual effects you can really control that, and he uses
Hmm.
that really well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think there's a lot of bashing of special effects these days that like people don't really
Hmm.
understand, or there's a lot of
Yeah.
outcry about it. But I think that
Because I remember seeing a quote where it was like, not everyone's an artist, but everyone can be a critic.
right, yeah.
So people can point out what's wrong, but not everyone can improve upon that or make it better or even know how to do that kind of thing. Like, I
Hmm.
fully admit there's a lot I do not know how to do. And so I'm very hesitant to critique things
Hmm.
that don't look great because I don't know the situation of if they were overworked, if there wasn't enough time, if there wasn't enough money put into it. So it's this kind of interesting dynamic of figuring out when you can like point something out for not looking good, but also like maybe bringing something new or like how to fix it or
Hmm.
or praising the good special effects.
Right. One thing that I've been loving recently, Corridor Digital has been doing this series on VFX artists react to like bad and great CGI, which is a really good chance for you to get to see like visual effects artists talking about what goes into visual effects and how it's done really well and some mistakes that are made. So that can give you a greater understanding of how that all works. I recommend it.
I really love about that series is it's not just them laughing or squirming or cringing at bad CG or going, wow, this looks really good. They really go into the nitty gritty and depth of why something looks so good or why something might not look the greatest. And they also have had times where they're like, hey, we're going to look at the scene and then we're going to see what we can do to make it better from our end. Yeah. And it's really cool how they aren't this big ball of negativity saying like, this looks terrible. We could do better. It's more like, what can we do to make it better? Like, how can we show people like, this is what you could do to make it better. And this is how it works. And it's really, really fascinating how much they know and how much they're very positive about all of it and understanding just because they're VFX artists themselves.
Yeah. One thing I think about pretty often too is I feel like we're at a point where visual effects have gotten really great and they're most of the time can be pretty indistinguishable from reality. I mean, there are of course movies that come out and you're like, okay, that doesn't look great. Typically, you know, we've been talking about how human faces aren't quite at a point where they look totally realistic, or sometimes physics are off, or you can tell there's green screen used. But for the most part, I think we've gotten pretty much perfected with a lot of things in visual effects. But part of me wonders, like in 20 years, are people going to look back and say, man, that looks so fake? As we do now.
Because like when you look at movies like Gemini Man or like The Irishman with the de-aging VFX, there's this, we're at the beginning of learning how to make human faces like super realistic. And I don't think we've quite perfected that yet. So I'm wondering if like in 20 years we're going to have perfected it and look back to like Gemini Man and be like, wow, that looks really outdated.
Probably.
Even though like right now there are a lot of like a majority of that movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but a majority of that movie, young Will Smith looks like really good. And it's not until you like deeply analyze it or when you see a couple of scenes where you're like, wow, that doesn't quite work. But I think for the most part, it's kind of incredible what they've done.
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing we were talking about earlier is I think what's important to making good special effects is that blending of practical and CGI, I think is a big factor. And then I think too, I don't know, one of the things with like Avatar is that it had these amazing visual effects, but the story for the most part was pretty forgettable. It drew from a lot of, you know, different stories. People compare it to so many different things. And there's this great video Jax Films did a while back where he's like, all right, can you name 3 characters from the
I remember that
highest grossing film of all time, Avatar? And like no one could do it. I think I could name like 2 characters from it, but
I think I could name 1.
I know there's Jake Sully and there's Neytiri. That's about all I got.
Yep.
But I think
Sigourney Weaver.
Yeah, the visual effects were a big part of what sold that film. But I think nowadays that doesn't really work as well. I think that's a circumstance where like the story was in service of the visual effects rather than the visual effects being in service of the story. And I think that's what's kind of most important, is not like focusing primarily on the visual effects, but having the visual effects serve as a way to tell like a really great story. And we have so much possibility these days too. We can tell so many different stories now because of the point that visual effects have gotten to.
And it's also important, like I remember reading something or hearing something where it was like visual effects is a tool you can use to like better the story. So that's where I think Christopher Nolan and David Fincher do really well with it, to where they don't use special effects in a way that they rely heavily upon it. They build a story and characters that they want to tell, and then use special effects as a tool to fine tune that story. And they don't necessarily have the visual effects as the base. And that's where I also think, like these Marvel movies, or at least Avengers, it was more about telling this story of these characters fighting this grand enemy rather than going like, what can we accomplish with visual effects? Where I feel that was kind of like what Avatar was.
Yeah. One of the things I just thought of too is like, in comparison, I feel like the Marvel movies are kind of one thing that stands out as like the big visual effects blockbusters these days.
Yeah.
You had like the Godzilla movie come out too, which was another like mostly, you know, visual effects, monsters fighting, good time of a movie. But one thing that kind of makes Joker stand out is its lack of like big visual effects. It was a lot more grounded. I didn't even think about that when I watched it or when we talked about it, but it does feel very different.
The fact that if there were visual effects, you probably couldn't tell at all.
Right.
They're very subtle.
Right. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier talking about Guillermo del Toro and how people have kind of lost that wonder. And do you have any ideas of how you would kind of bring that back, or maybe combat this lack of wonder of visual effects, since there's so many movies with this overwhelming visual effects now?
I think it's hard just because they are so ubiquitous. It's almost we don't notice them as much anymore. So I think just learning what really goes into that, and like we mentioned earlier, that VFX Artists React series is a great opportunity to get to see what really goes into visual effects. What would you say?
Along those same lines, where I think if people learn to understand like what all goes into visual effects, people can kind of bring back that wonder, because you're able to realize like what all the people did to make things work. Like if you look at Gravity, there's one shot of Sandra Bullock just like kind of spinning. Yeah. And I remember a video where it was like, I want you to guess what's CG in this. And then it like did like a wipe, and it was just her like spinning in a white room.
Yep.
And it was just like all of it was CG, but you couldn't tell. And it was very like what Guillermo del Toro was talking about. It brought back this wonder for me, because I was thinking about like how they made it, and also what must have gone into making that. And so going back to your point with Corridor and their VFX Artists React, I think one way people can kind of bring back that wonder is like understanding the hard work that goes into VFX, which is one way I've learned kind of to like be more full of wonder.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's where we'll wrap it up, talking about that, and we'll move into some movie recommendations. So, Luke, do you have a movie recommendation?
I do. I would say along the same lines. We're talking about VFX. I would talk about Blade Runner 2049, because that won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects, I believe, 2018 or 2017, because I know First Man won pretty recently. Anyways, there's a scene in that movie where I don't want to spoil anything if you haven't seen it, but there's this almost photorealistic, or I would say the closest thing I've seen to a real human being, completely digitally recreated, and it's incredible. And on top of that, there's so many uses of practical effects on top of that, and it's this epic story that I really love, and it's got style out the wazoo.
I think the visual effects there really give that movie its style and its world, and its I think that's a great example of how to use visual effects well. The only movie that I've seen recently is Paddington 2. I just watched, but I think it's a good tie-in too, because that movie, I mean, of course there's a ton of visual effects to make a bear real, and it is really great, and it's just a great movie overall. But I think like as I was watching it, I was just overwhelmed by the sense of every shot looks perfectly like framed, and it has the storybook feel where every frame seems like it's perfectly designed, and some of the camera movement they have in these different like transitional shots of like spinning around the whole room, all this crazy stuff that they did. I don't know, it's just a great example of like visually how to tell a story, as well as like along with a lot of visual effects that go with that.
Gotcha.
And
Yeah,
it's just it's a great time, and it's a really fun movie, and it'll lift your heart. So
I've heard nothing but good things about that movie, and I have neither seen the first or second one.
Yep, so I watched both of them pretty recently. I watched the first one over the summer. It's also quite good. A lot of great like visual comedy in it too. Anyway, yep, that's my recommendation, and I think we'll leave it off there. So if you guys have any thoughts about this, leave them down in the comments below. We'd love to start some discussion about visual effects and how we can appreciate them more. Also, how you guys think they can be used better in films these days. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Goodbye.